Throughout this age, mankind has had one state of consciousness, and when I speak of the age, I speak of the last 6,000 years. We've had one state of consciousness and one orientation, and we have had one social order. I know that there have been many diversities in nations and ethnic groups, and of course, but overall, transcending all of these diversities, there has been one basic social order. Now, our state of consciousness, I have spoken of it many times, and it was revealed to us through the Bible that this is a state of consciousness that began with a man named Adam who was transformed from an unawakened state to an awakened state in a particular state of consciousness, and we have been in that state ever since. And it's a state that is defined largely by our mental processes of being able to judge between dualities. And it's also defined by our sense of separation and independence. And it's out of this sense that our orientation came into being and also became firmly established, just like our state of consciousness. And our orientation has been based on this sense of separation, to depend primarily on our own strength, to have as our top priority in life self-preservation, to be completely self-reliant if we are able to. That has been our orientation. But the social order that has been established since the beginning of the age is something that a lot of people are not even aware of. And it is related to our state of consciousness and our orientation. It's basically intertwined with those and based on those. And so we have had these different local expressions of social life, but overall there's been one dominant social order for mankind. And again, this is spoken of in the Bible, and we can learn about this. And in fact, it's one of the most dominant themes of the Bible. Basically, what happened in the beginning of the age was that there were men who became self-reliant, and out of this orientation of human strength, showed themselves to be stronger than other people. They were stronger perhaps physically, but most likely they were stronger mentally. And so, as this small group of human beings exhibited this greater strength than their other humans, than their brothers and sisters, as they exhibited this greater strength, they rose to the top of the social order. And that could have meant that they were leaders of the community. It could have meant that they were looked up to, and that people turned to them for advice and wisdom. And also, it tended to be an economic reality, that their strength was displayed through economic uh, proliferation. They became more wealthy, they had more than their other people. And this has been the social order, is that there has been a small percentage of the human community throughout the age that has risen to the top because of their strength, that everybody was moving in human strength, but this small group showed that they had greater strength than others. So they rose to the top of the social order with wealth generally, and with power, and the really the aspect of this social order that is really uh, sad or poignant is that the percentage of actual population was very unequal. In other words, it wasn't 50-50. It wasn't that the higher strata of society was 50% and the haves and the have-nots were 50-50. No, it was, and it wasn't 60-40. In fact, if I could, I would just say that it was somewhere around 10% versus 90%. Now that, of course, is not it's not an actual equation. It's 10% that could fluctuate less or more, and 90% that could fluctuate less or more. But I will, in this talk, I will call it the 10% and the 90%. And of course, when we think of that, it seems very unjust. It seems sort of out of whack that there could be 10% of human society at the top enjoying a much better lifestyle than the rest of humanity, and the rest of humanity is 90%. And so this is an unjust social order, and it has been an unjust social order. but it was the social order that the age began with and has been moving in ever since. It became established, and there's never been any real change. Of course, the 90% have at times called for greater equality in this social order, and called for a greater um, sharing of resources and wealth, etc. But it's never really happened. Um, so, out of this social order, which, as we can see just by the numbers, is unjust, came an even greater unjust quality. And that is that in many cases, in many different displays of this social order, the higher echelon of society became overbearing. They became harsh and cruel and wielded their power over the 90% of the rest of society, um, in a terrible, terrible way. Um, so that not only were they enjoying a better lifestyle, they actually that that seemed in these cases that it wasn't enough that they would enjoy, but rather that they would um, lord over their brothers and sisters with cruelty, with their strength, and this developed into a an actual spiritual condition. Um, what this brand of cruelty was, uh, it it affected people in many different ways. It could affect their bodies, that they were oftentimes, the 90% has been enslaved and has had to either work and bear the brunt of harsh work conditions, or they've been mistreated physically. That has often been the case, and but the true quality of this treatment from the higher echelon is it's actually a spiritual condition that they were wielding, and a spiritual kind of power and energy. And the the Bible calls this condition for the 90% that are subject to it oppression. And oppression is, of course, a word that we are all familiar with, and it basically means that people are pressed down. People are pressed not only physically, but they're actually pressed in their psyche to where they become downcast, so discouraged, so despairing of their life being any better, that they lose dignity, they lose hope, and they lose the goodness of life. Their lives become very very hard, and this has been going on throughout this age, and it's a very um, dark struggle for mankind because we have never been able to change the social order, and it's still going on today. And so when we understand that there's actually a spiritual energy at work here, it becomes clear that this is not just an economic divide, it's not just a strength divide, and it's not just a power divide. It's an actual spiritual outworking of oppression. And so this takes us back to the beginning of the age again for a minute, where we have to think about and look at the reason that there would be this kind of treatment, that it would be a dark spiritual treatment of our fellow man. So we go back to the beginning when Adam awoke to this state of consciousness that we're in, and we look at again at the dualistic nature of this state of consciousness, and good and evil are immediately apparent as very dominant um, aspects of this mentality. In other words, people have judged on the level of dualism on every level, but good and evil has been perhaps the most prominent judgment that we make. We make it all the time in our minds. When we're judging situations, we judge them as good or evil. But the problem with this dualistic mindset is that evil came into being through this dualistic mind. It had never existed prior to this, and the way that what we have come to know as evil, the way that it came to be, it came to pass, was that evil was the flip side of good that men became aware of. And there was a temptation associated with this, because as soon as evil came into our conscious awareness that good had this other aspect, this other flip side to it, the temptation was to explore the possibilities of evil, to to go in and see what evil was, and see what evil felt like, and see what evil could do. And this has been our temptation throughout the age, is that we brought evil into existence, but instead of just letting it lie, we wanted to know what evil was all about and what evil could do. And so, going back to our social order, what we see is that with this dualistic mind set, the upper echelon of society, the strong, were also greatly tempted by evil. and they often gave expression to that temptation. And so then we have this cruelty, we have murder, we have uh, raping and pillaging, we have all kinds of evil actions coming forth out of this because it it wasn't enough that this strong elite group would just enjoy their status of being wealthy and so forth. They also were tempted to carry out evil toward the 90%. So that's why this dynamic is actually a spiritual dynamic, is that it has to do with our state of consciousness and the cruelty of men toward one another, which you do not find in any other species. The cruelty of man toward our fellow man is part of our state of consciousness. It's part of the outworking of evil that was an outworking of our dualistic mind and the temptation to uh, to give expression to evil. So basically, this quality of oppression that has been uh, that has characterized the lives of the 90% is it's a spiritual outworking that has made human life uh, just really, really hard for a lot of people. And um, there have been, as I said, there have been attempts on the part of the 90% to rise up and to try and bring about a different, more equitable social order, but they have never succeeded. If they did, they succeeded only briefly. And the basic social order has held fast throughout this age. There have also been, well, basically, what happened as these uprisings, one by one, fell short and failed, um, people began to realize that they needed a different approach. They instead of trying to overthrow the hierarchy of the 10% that has, of course, uh, changed with each generation, but somehow been carried over from generation to generation. Um, Rather than trying to overthrow, because that didn't work and never did, the 90% that were suffering through life um, decided that what they really needed was a refuge more than anything else. They needed a refuge to be a place to go, a situation to go into where they didn't feel so oppressed and where they could find camaraderie and where they could find hope. And so there began to arise in human society this the social order stayed the same, but there began to arise this aspect for the 90% of situations that they could turn to, that they could find refuge. And because it was a spiritual quality of oppression that was bearing down on them, mostly these refuges took the form of spiritual gatherings or communities. So we see it beginning, actually, we see it in the Bible beginning with the people of Israel. And the people of Israel have, they're very ancient people. They go back 4,000 years at least. And they have often been enslaved. They have often been, they know what oppression feels like. But it hasn't been always strictly a political oppression or slavery. Even when the people were free and were self-governing, there was this social order that was at work in the community. Because this social order transcends all divides of human life, racial, national, ethnic. It's been everywhere, and it has permeated everywhere in any human gathering, any human settlement of life. So what we see is that in the Bible, the people of Israel they often speak of oppression. They speak of the difficulty of life, and really they helped to define certain aspects of this dynamic that we might not have realized if they hadn't. For instance, they helped to define the fact that this is a spiritual dynamic, and that it's not strictly based on wealth and power. In other words, there's a quality to it that a very wealthy and powerful person can be part of the oppressed, can come under oppression. And contrarily, a very poor person financially and power-wise can be a part of the elite oppressors. So this is something that we see in the Bible. We see a man like King David, who was a king. You can't get much higher in the echelon of society than that, and he was wealthy. He was extremely wealthy, but he, in all of his psalms, cries out to God that his situation is an oppressive one, and somehow he's the brunt of oppression, even though he himself is what you would assume was a part of the higher echelon. So the Bible teaches us that this is a spiritual condition, that it's not strictly wealth and power, and the haves and have-nots. And then Jesus came along, and Jesus taught us many, many things about ourselves, about human society, and about human life. And he taught us about our state of consciousness, following on the heels of Adam and what happened with Adam coming into awakening to this state of consciousness. And Jesus showed us that we were still in that state of consciousness, that we were still very much moving in dualities and moving in that sense of separation from God. And in fact, that's why his greatest work was the atonement, to try and reconcile us to God. And in that way, to help us to come out of the Adamic state of consciousness and move forward in the evolution of consciousness. But Jesus taught us that that's still where we were at, was that we were in that sense of separation. We were in the dualistic mindset. We were in evil and tempted by evil. And we were in the same old social order, that the age-old social order of the 10%, 90%. So Jesus was a very compassionate person. I think his compassion was, as far as people, historical people that we are aware of, his compassion was greater than any other human being. And his compassion caused him to become like a champion to the oppressed, and to extend healing, because oppression causes disease. It causes complete bodily malfunction and breakdown in many, many cases. So the people that came to him were not only broken in body, they were, generally speaking, broken in their spirit, in oppression. So Jesus healed them, but he also attempted very much to give them hope, to give them dignity, to try and lift them out of their spiritual morass that was causing them to not only be oppressed, but to despair of life itself. And so a very famous uh, dialogue that is recorded in the Bible is called the Beatitudes, or the Sermon on the Mount. And this was basically Jesus speaking right to the heart of oppressed humanity and giving them the greatest hope that mankind has ever heard, and ever received. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit. In other words, though you've been downtrodden all of your life through this social order, you are blessed if you could just realize it, because there is nothing keeping the oppressed of this world from laying hold of spiritual riches. And that was what Jesus taught. And following Jesus, human society began to stir in this same arena of compassion and trying to give hope to the oppressed. And so what we see is that the apostles went forth with the message of atonement. And this was an empowering message because of the sense of separation that we had been stuck in, uh, the apostles went forth with this message. And then on the heels of the apostolic age, the apostolic movement, there arose the church. And in the beginning, this was the Catholic Church. That's the only church there was for a long time, thousands of years. So the church sort of took over from where the apostles left off. And one very interesting thing about the church was that they made a very important priority they gave to helping the oppressed and being a refuge for the oppressed. And of course, the numbers were so great of the 90% of human society at that point that the church began to proliferate through this doctrine of wanting to help the oppressed. And so we see that in the beginning of the church age, it was a viable refuge for the oppressed. The oppressed came in. There were no exclusions to who could come in. They came in and they were received and they were bandaged up and they were given hope through the extending of the church's mercy and grace. And so the church filled in numbers. You know, it's worldwide. It's in the billions now. And the oppressed flocked to its doors, and they did find refuge for a while, but unfortunately, it didn't last too long, because the problem was that the church, who they claimed to be the representatives or the representative of the apostolic movement, carrying on not only the apostles' message, but also the teaching of Jesus and the great compassion of Jesus. But as time went by, the spiritual quality that had been so powerful in Jesus and the apostles began to wane. And what you had at that point was well-intended human beings coming into the church as taking positions of leadership, trying to carry forth the situation of being a refuge for the oppressed. But human beings have always been tempted by evil and have always been corruptible. And so without Jesus, without that strong influence that was carried forth through the apostles for a while, without that power, that spiritual power of good, the leaders of the church, in fact, the whole church institution, became not only corrupt in human terms, but it actually became infiltrated by the 10% hierarchy, the status quo elite of the human social order. And this happened for a very good reason. The status quo elite wanted to have a hand in the church because they felt threatened by Jesus's teaching. They felt threatened by uh, the um, the fact that the church was being a refuge for the oppressed. That threatened the 10% because they thought what would come on the heels of having a refuge would be empowerment. And if the 90% became empowered, ever became empowered, the 10% would be history. So cleverly, the 10% hierarchy in this social order infiltrated the church. And when they did that, they very much tampered with the doctrine, the church doctrines that were from that time forward put forth as true doctrines, but they were actually doctrines meant to discredit Jesus and to lessen his appeal and to make it harder for the oppressed to receive comfort from Jesus. And so that's what happened in the church, and it hasn't really been changed. It hasn't changed. It's been the state of the church ever since, and even the Pentecostal um, independent church that broke off from the Catholic Church, the institution of the Catholic Church, has carried over many of the false doctrines. So it too has been basically off limits for the oppressed, and because once the church became infiltrated, it no longer served as a refuge for the oppressed. The oppressed still flocked to it, but they didn't find the kind of comfort that they did in the beginning. Now, another um, development of this similar kind, took place a couple of centuries after the church had been infiltrated. And this was the rise of a religion called Islam. And Islam began as a refuge for the oppressed, because I think that they saw that the leaders of this movement saw in the beginning that how great was not only how great were the numbers of the oppressed, but how deep was the plight and the suffering. So Islam also began as a refuge for the oppressed, and it also began to attract great numbers of people. But Islam's doctrine was very different than the church. The church tried to comfort the oppressed with promises of a future uh, place that the oppressed could look forward to going, called heaven. And that was the real comfort that the church had to offer. It was on a human practical level, it was the comfort of camaraderie, and it was the comfort of refuge. But the great hope that the church offered had to do with the afterlife. It didn't have to do with this life. In other words, the church taught that there was no empowerment that could change the social order in this life. So the empowerment would needed to come from hope. It needed to come from believing, from faith in a glorious, different afterlife than this life had been for the oppressed. Islam took a much different approach. Their doctrine was one of instant, immediate empowerment through numbers. In other words, Islam saw the hierarchy of the elite, status quo 10%, and the social order that they had established as being very unjust. And they saw the 90% of people who were suffering and were poor and were downtrodden. And what Islam, the doctrine of Islam, offered was empowerment through numbers, through cohesion, through organization, through rising up in a way that would not fail in terms of numbers and power. And so the doctrine of Islam was very political, and it had to do with now. It did not have anything to do with the future or the afterlife. It had to do with overthrowing the social order now through the empowerment that could come through numbers, because obviously the 90% had the advantage with numbers, but it also had to do with empowering the numbers through incitement, through uh, um, even arming them, even militancy, teaching them ways that they could be empowered now. And so many people were attracted to this new doctrine because there was a criticism leveled at the church by by the oppressed that said, it's great to have hope in an afterlife, but what about now? And so Islam appealed to many people who were of that mind, that it presented a way for them to deal with the present in this life, because there was no guarantee of the afterlife. But so Islam soon found itself with a huge influx, a great proliferation of oppressed peoples coming in and saying, yes, we want to be empowered now. And unfortunately, something very similar happened to Islam that happened to the Catholic Church. And that is that it was corrupted by evil, by human weakness in regards to evil, and it was pretty much infiltrated and taken over by the 10% who came in, and they again, they thought, we're not going to sit back and let the 90% become empowered. We're going to change this doctrine. We're going to introduce new doctrines that serve to water down to scatter the focus and the energy and the organization of this rising movement of empowerment. And they succeeded. And that's why Islam has always boasted of the great ability. They've held to their original doctrine that they could, at some point, become empowered enough to overthrow the 10%, and they have held to that. But centuries have gone by and they've never been able to. In other words, as great as Islam became, it was not able to change the social order. So we have the church, we have Islam, we have 90% of the people still being oppressed, and nothing has changed. Not really. I mean, there have been some uh, instances where it looked like things were changing, but the social order has held firm. And this is very hard to accept. It's very hard to to feel good about, you know. But there has actually been throughout all of this, and in in the hope of not despairing, there has actually been a true refuge for the oppressed in this age all along. But this refuge for the oppressed is, for the most part, hidden, and 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 the reason for this is that this refuge that I'm talking about now has not it has not been susceptible to infiltration. It has remained pure, and it has remained intact even today, and it has been with us throughout this age. And this true refuge for the oppressed is an inward uh, refuge in our own consciousness. And that's why it hasn't been infiltrated and it hasn't been corrupted by human weakness. It is a refuge that we each can lay hold of in our hearts that no one can touch. No one can touch us when we find it. And it is a refuge that gives us both hope and empowerment. So let us look at this a little bit, and let us try and understand a little about how we can come into this refuge. And actually, I think that when Israel was, some of the Israelites were giving voice to their oppression, they had a pretty good idea of this refuge. They may not have totally found it and moved in it, but they had the right idea about where to look. For them, the refuge was not human; it was in God. And in all the Psalms, we read this very clearly: God is my refuge. So that's the right place to look. But God is not some personal being that lives up in heaven. We have to correct those misperceptions, and we have to understand, as Jesus said, that God is within us, that God is spirit and consciousness. And so the refuge is in God, but it's in us. And that's where we need to turn. And I think that if you read the Psalms, it's clear that the yearning was there for refuge, but that the psalmists never really found it. And so, what is the key to finding it? And the key is Jesus. The key is not only what he taught, but it's what he embodied. It's the state of consciousness that he was and was moving in. Christ consciousness. That is the refuge. And it's interesting because Jesus told a parable about this that it speaks right to the truth of it, but it's still hidden to most people. And it's a parable of a flock of sheep and a sheep pen. And Jesus is talking to his sheep, and he says, I am the good shepherd. I am the gate to the sheep pen. And what is the sheep pen? The sheep pen is the refuge. It's that place that we can go and find comfort and find peace in our predicament in this world. With the social order just the way it is, we can go in and we can find comfort, peace, and empowerment. That is the sheep pen that Jesus was speaking of. And he said, my sheep know my name and they know my voice. And I am the gate for them to enter. So when they come to me, no one can snatch them out of my hand. I will lead them in to the sheep pen. And he also goes on to describe how there have been many others that have assumed to be the leaders and the helpers of the sheep pen, but that they have actually been hired hands, and they have been corrupted human beings that were what Jesus said they were thieves and robbers that came in to the church and came into Islam, and instead of really bringing about the quality of refuge to the oppressed, they padded their own pockets and they scattered the flock. But Jesus was the real shepherd, and he was the gate to the sheep pen. And this meant that the sheep had to learn how to pass through that gate. And they could. It was entirely possible. But there was a certain quality that they needed about their own lives to be able to enter. In other words, it wasn't just enough to be the oppressed. There was something they needed to do in order to lay hold of this refuge. And that something was the evolution of consciousness. It was to break free of Adamic consciousness and move forward into the state of consciousness that Jesus embodied, called Christ consciousness. And maybe not all the way into the fullness of that state that such as Jesus was, but to break free from Adamic consciousness, to break free from the orientation of human strength, and to move forward in the evolution of consciousness. And this anybody can do. And in fact, Jesus empowered us through the atonement in a very great way to be able to break out of the sense of separation, which was very binding for us and keeping us stuck. So, right there, Jesus empowered us to be able to move forward. And the further forward that we move, we also find that our dualistic mind begins to begins to change, and we begin to see that dualism was it only led to temptation. It only led to the empowerment of evil. So Jesus empowered us through much of what he did and taught, and it's up to us to let this empowerment work in our hearts and take us forward in the evolution of consciousness toward Christ consciousness. Then we can enter this refuge for the oppressed. And it doesn't change the social order, but it changes us. And it's not pie in the sky. It's not strictly the hope in an afterlife, because when we are changed and when we are spiritually empowered, our lives change and we become free. We become very free inside. And when we become free, there's no social order that can press down upon us and cause us to despair, because we inwardly are free. So it's very much an empowerment for the present tense. And it's also very hidden, which means it can never be corrupted or become impure. It can never be tainted, and it can never become infiltrated. And so this is what we want to work toward, because the more that we break out of Adamic consciousness and head toward Christ consciousness, the more our sight is fixed on the gate, and we can very much begin to feel what the refuge feels like, and to experience it, and to find refuge more and more in that direction. So take heart, all who are oppressed in this world. There is a place, and that's what Jesus came to show us. There is a refuge, and it's a refuge that when you find it, no one can take it out of your hands.